I quote from The Magic Lantern by Robert Florey. At the beginning of the year 1923, Rudolph Valentino asked me to accompany him to visit his palm reader. This guy, Professor Winton, had been located in Ocean Park for 15 years in a boutique that had the address of 2928 Oceanfront Avenue. The whole world was convinced that he read the future as though reading a book, and most actors came to consult him. He worked between a shooting gallery and a souvenir shop. The walls of his narrow consultation salon were covered with the handprints of his most famous clients. The noises, the cries, and the music of popular village fair environment penetrated the sanctuary where the incense odor battled the emanations coming from the fryer of a hot dog seller. Professor Winton enjoyed a good reputation, and the most famous Hollywood personalities would swear by him. It is that his predictions often came true. Valentino would return to visit him at twilight, in order to not be recognized on the street. He parked his Cunningham along the curb, a block of houses away from the boutique. We passed along the avenue quickly, fearing the last of the bathers. We would have loved to have been shadows. That night, Valentino ordered the deluxe $5 reading. We had at least 45 minutes there. Winton told Rudolph that he would soon take a long journey, and that he would still know days of glory, but that his existence would be brief. "This is not the first time you have foretold this to me," Valentino told him. "I know that my lifeline is short, but I trust in my star. I'm certain that 20 years from now I will still come to consult you." "I hope that's true," responded the professor. "Sadly, it is not what I read in your hand." It was nearly nightfall when we left, and Rudolph took leave of Winton, laughing. But while we got in the car, he had a fearful air. "Let's eat a bowl of clam chowder at Crystal Pier," he said to me, "and then we'll walk around a little." 3 minutes later, we had arrived. Malibu didn't exist at that time, and many movie stars resided at Crystal Pier. Seated on the high stools in the open-air bar railway car of Joe the Greek, we served ourselves some shellfish soup. In the coffee cups, Joe poured us red wine that he bought more or less illegally from a rabbi. Rudolph remained silent. We then went to the end of the pier, gone today, and we sat on a bench. He lit up an Abdullah, blowing out the smoke. Only the sound of the ocean was heard. After a long pause of silence, Valentino then told me, "I don't believe all that nonsense. Anyway, I won't go to the professor's any more." "Every time you say the same thing," I said to him, "but you always return to him. One time within less than a month. If you don't add faith to his predictions, why do you still go back to visit?" He replied, "The first time that he examined my hand through his thick magnifying glass, he told me I was going to become a celebrity. Now he only talks of my approaching death, and I'm not even 29 years old. There's something troubling in it all. You will get to be such a ripe old age that in 1960 you will play character roles in movies wearing a wig." I told him this to cheer him up. End quote. The Magic Lantern is the title of a chapter in Robert Florey's book, Hollywood, Yesterday and Today, published first in 1948 and updated and reissued in 1966 with both editions in French. Who was Robert Florey? What does his chapter, The Magic Lantern, reveal about Rudolph Valentino? Do those letters Valentino wrote to Florey, which are included in this book, do they reveal that Rudolph Valentino was gay? Are those letters racy and sexual in tone, as it is being alleged? Today, I will answer these questions, and I will read those letters as we analyze Robert Florey's Valentino memoir, The Magic Lantern.
Ciao, I am Renato Floris, the proud publisher of all the entertaining and scholarly books about Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova by Evelyn Zumaya. I am here today with Evelyn to discuss more about her fascinating work. Ciao, Evelyn.
Ciao, Renato. The story of this episode began when I was informed that Robert Florey's The Magic Lantern is being referenced by a known Valentino porn fiction writer as the source of their claim that Valentino led his life as a closeted homosexual and that he had an affair with Robert Florey. I will admit the magic lantern was not a primary source at the time for my work, but in light of the new allegations, I definitely needed to take a closer look. Contrary to what I've been accused of for too many years, I have no agenda in researching Rambova, Valentino, or anyone else. My only agenda is to discover and uncover the facts, and in regards to the rumors that Valentino was gay, I am always interested to see if a new claim has any credibility, any merit. But as Florey's book was not in English, it would have to be translated first. But then it dawned on me, wait a minute, I think I do have that in English. I recalled that years ago someone sent me an English translation of The Magic Lantern, but where was it? As you know well, Renato, I have a pretty massive Valentino archive, which is accumulated from about 20 years of research. So the answers to the questions posed about the letters Valentino wrote to Florey were buried within all those newspaper articles and binders and my years of notes and materials filling bins of fat folders which are yellowing with age at this point. So I began the search for that English translation of Robert Florey's Magic Lantern and initially found nothing. I turned to my digital archive, which is housed on 2 retired laptops, my current laptop, and a few external hard drives. In one of those laptops, I found a random folder labeled To Go, and inside this folder I found another folder labeled Old Affairs Valentino General, and there I found a folder labeled Florey, which contained the fine translation from the French of the Magic Lantern along with other translated citations referring to Rudolph Valentino in Florey's book. Now this translation was sent to me by a woman whose name lamentably was not on the file. I knew the email account I had at the time had long been closed, but I felt as she sent it to me, she would want it to be read. Why else? I'm not sure why I had never thought to make the translation public, but in light of it now being sourced as the proof Valentino was gay with those letters of particular mention, I was thrilled to find the English translation and began to give it a closer read.
Before you tell us what was revealed, maybe you can tell listeners just who was Robert Florey.
Renato, that's a good point. So before we move on here, then, a little bit of background information about the 3 main characters in this Magic Lantern revelation. At the center of the story, of course, Rudolph Valentino himself, with most of the narrative taking place in 1922. He is then famous, yet unhappy with his employer, famous Players Lasky, and in love with Natasha Rambova, having married her in May. As I am sure our knowledgeable listeners know, Valentino and Rambova were forced to separate just days after their marriage because he had not waited a full year since his divorce from his first wife. So the marriage to Natasha was ruled null and void. Robert Florey's first-hand anecdotes in The Magic Lantern take place primarily in the summer of 1922, when Natasha was in exile in upstate New York, hiding out in the woods of the Adirondack Mountains at her mother and stepfather's estate, Foxlair, while Valentino was alone in their home in Los Angeles. Now, the second character in this story is Paul Ivanhoe, a French friend of Valentino's and Florey's, who was working in Hollywood as a cameraman, a cinematographer. Ivanhoe, by the way, would enjoy a lifelong career in Hollywood. And lastly, Robert Florey, another Frenchman, who would work in Hollywood as a director, screenplay writer, and actor, but in 1922, he worked as a European press agent for Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, just before he began working for Rudolph Valentino in the same capacity as his European advance man. Florey came to Hollywood in 1921 as a journalist for the French fan magazine Ciné Magazine.
Valentino spoke French because his mother was French. And this friendship with these 2 French men reminds me of something Balthasar Coué wrote about in The True Rudolph Valentino, which I just translated from Spanish into English. He wrote how Valentino found friendships in Hollywood mostly with Europeans, whether French or Spanish.
I found that an interesting observation too, Renato, yes. I guess Valentino felt more comfortable in what today is called the expat community. I also think the correspondents for the foreign movie magazines were eagerly embraced by the stars and their managers, seriously wine and dined, if you will, because they provided all of that juicy press in Europe. I think this was certainly the case with Florey when he arrived in Hollywood working for Cine Magazine, and yes, Baltasar Coué, who wrote for several Spanish-speaking magazines. So we dive in here. What does Florey's magic lantern reveal about Rudolph Valentino? Is there any truth to that claim about those racy letters and the setting of some tone? Now, as far as the composition of this chapter on Valentino, Florey attempts to establish some biographical narrative, which is based on the stock studio-generated PR version and which provides nothing new, really. But within Florey's recollections of his work with Valentino, there are some interesting and valuable anecdotes. And yes, there are those letters. Florey opens in a sentimental recollection of a day sometime in the late 1950s, when he and Paul Ivanhoe returned to visit Valentino's home he shared with Natasha in the Whitley Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles. The home had just been partially destroyed by a wrecking ball that day in advance of the construction of a freeway. So here we have Florey and Ivanhoe picking through the rubble while sharing memories of Valentino. I read from the Magic Lantern, and I quote, "The new freeway linking Los Angeles to the north of Hollywood sliced through the heart of town and passed through the top of Whitley Heights, which is called Ghostland, because of the disappearing artist who lived there in the old days. It rejoined Highland and Cahuenga Avenues, which crossed at the base of the mountainside north of that hill, which hangs over Hollywood Boulevard. The first swing of the wrecking ball had been given some days before, and nothing more than a few parts of walls remained, floorboards, stairs, and foundations. All that made the face of Wedgwood Place had been knocked down, such that your gaze plunged directly into the interior of the house, which Paul Ivanhoe, and I had not had the occasion to enter in the last 28 years. I saw before me the rubble of the entryway, and of Rudy's bedroom, as well as the stairs that descended towards what would have been the dining room and the living room. The house was built against the side of the hill, the kind whose entry is even with the street, and the other rooms are found below. Some boards had been nailed crosswise over gaping openings, and warning informed passers that it was dangerous to enter. Passing over the taut rope of the stairway, we entered the house. First off, I found a piece of colored tile that I picked up. Upon looking at it, I remembered that Valentino had bought these tiles when we were together in Italy, more than 30 years ago. In the lower level, to the back of which had been the garden, grass pushed up through the cracked cement of the large pool. Some piles of rubble remained throughout, and in walking I crushed pieces of glass coming from the high Spanish-style windows of the living room. On the lower floor, looking towards the top of the hill, I had the impression of being in the middle of a set in an abandoned studio. Within 2 or 3 days, not much would remain of anything here. I went back up to the entry, but I was unable to feel the emotion I had expected. That house was stone dead as the man who had resided there." End quote. Florey, coldly admitting to being unable to feel emotion, and Ivanhoe then proceed to visit Valentino's crypt, and after this opening scenario, Florey creates the briefest possible version of Valentino's life, with many errors, such as his saying Valentino's funeral was not paid for. Of course, we know now that it was. I discovered this in the archives of Campbell's funeral home on the invoice itself, which I have made public. Now, George Ullman paid for the funeral, by the way, in full in 2 payments. Another error. Florey also claims Valentino's family knew no one in New York City when he arrived. We now know, thanks to the documents themselves, that Valentino's sister-in-law's uncle, Ernesto Filomarino, welcomed him to New York City, as well as his godfather, Frank Manillo. At one point in his shorthand history, Florey states, and I quote, that one of Valentino's brothers was a veterinarian. Now, I think we know that Valentino had one brother, and his father was the veterinarian, so there are some real hitches in the biographical narrative. but it is an anecdote in which Florey relates a conversation he had with the director Emmett Flynn, who directed Valentino in The Married Virgin and gave him an early break in the movies. This is what first caught my attention. This because I knew it was also being alleged by the Valentino porn fiction writer that Emmett Flynn was another of Valentino's lovers. And again I quote The Magic Lantern. And I quote, "During that time I did understand English, but I spoke it with great difficulties. I had been in California for only a few weeks. I was able, however, to ask Emmett Flynn, what were the reasons that brought about choosing Valentino. Quote, I saw a good-looking guy in front of the studio door every morning, Flynn told me, and sometimes even on the stages having small roles, or again in the cafeteria. He had good facial expression, one of allure, and he would greet me with a warm smile each time he saw me. He was precisely the type that was needed for the character, an Italian aristocrat, and I was not able to even think of Antonio Moreno, Vitagraph star, because the role was not important enough for him. I called Valentino in the following day. He arrived at my desk, a carnation boutonniere, pearl gray fedora at the ear, and a cane in the hand. A bracelet encircled his wrist. His elegance surprised me to the point that I hired him immediately, without even asking him if he was capable of handling the role. He had an air about him that I didn't doubt for an instant his talent. He couldn't do worse than anyone else. He threw me a little when he asked me to let him speak French or an Italian in order to play the character better. While he was filming, I didn't have the slightest idea what he was presumably saying. He was convinced that the studio was going to hire him under contract for a year, but nothing came of it. The film was completed, he was let go. So spoke Emmett Flynn. For him, Valentino had been the token Italian, very noble, very handsome, who was sensible enough to only play characters whose dialogue he wanted to understand entirely." End quote.
I know you feel Florey was disloyal in relating some of his memories of Valentino. Is true?
Yes, I do think that, Renato. I think Florey's motive was to exploit his affiliation with Rudolph Valentino and to exact a certain revenge. And I will get to that reason here in a few. He did so, I feel, by betraying someone he claims to have been close to and a dear friend, by sensationally telling all, without much respect. I find some of his comments somewhat disloyal, as you said, and snide. And as one example, Florey's account of his work as a press agent or advance man on the Mineral Lava Tour, Valentino's cross-country dancing tour with Natasha. This meant Florey arranged for the press to be at the next station and organized publicity visits in the various cities. Now, on this point, in the history of his mineral lava employment with Valentino, Florey relates the following, and I quote, "At the Ritz Tower in New York, the cheering from the massive crowds on the street obliged him to send greetings from the window, like royalty, and the policemen stayed there permanently in order to unblock the traffic. Slowly moving back into the room, always continuing to smile at the crowd, Valentino said to me, 'Only a few months before my departure for the West, I would sleep in the summer under the Central Park bushes that you see just across the street. In the early morning, the policeman would shoo me away, and I would roam around that hotel completely broke, hoping to find something to do in order to make the 10 cents necessary to buy a cup of coffee and a donut for my breakfast. My clothes were wrinkled. I wasn't shaven, and I had an empty stomach. No one even gave me a look, and the magic of cinema happened. The crowds who ignored me and who left me to die of hunger are now the masses under my window cheering me. They have seen me on the screen dressed as an Arab, a bullfighter, a soldier, a Hindi, and that was enough for them to wait for me for hours down there. However, I am still the same man. How can you explain the stupidity of that crowd?" End quote. So the comment Florey attributes to Valentino, where he insults his fans, is not something I think any friend would repeat for posterity. It is not the kind of comment you would find in the George Ullman memoir. Ullman kept it classy and respectful all the way. Florey's general Valentino memories intrigue, however, in their detail, and I think it is well worth sharing a few here. And I quote from page 5056 in The Magic Lantern. "It is Paul Ivanhoe, cameraman from Nice, who introduced me to Alla Nazimova and to Rudolph Valentino. Rudy was 25 years old when I first met him. He had completed the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse and was preparing for uncharted seas at Metro with Alice Lake, Senate's renegade. Valentino lived in a house neighboring Warren Kerrigan's in Whitley Terrace. His constant companions were Jean de Lemure, Mario Carrillo, and Douglas Gerard. We developed a sincere friendship, and 2 years later he asked me to accompany him to Europe. Rudy was divorced from his first wife, Jean Acker, who had left the very night of their wedding. He loved to smoke one of his many pipes among friends, or horseback ride with Lemure or Carrillo. When he earned a little money, he spent a lot. He had an old Fiat, in which we would cruise around. As he was very nearsighted, which created the sensual expression in which so many women delighted, we would always be afraid of an accident when he would drive 100 miles per hour at night along the Pacific coast. He used to love raw onions, and his favorite liquor was Flora di Alpina. Rudy in all things showed himself to be very careless, and this gave Frederic, a polite German who served as his trustworthy butler, a great deal to do. Upon returning from the studio, Valentino would play for a few minutes with his guard dogs. Then he would take a shower and fall asleep completely nude on the rug in his bedroom. He would spend an infinite amount of time slicking his hair. He was extremely stylish, and he loved Florentine rings and large chain bracelets. Frederic's wife would cook him excellent dinners, in which Chaplin or Linder would partake from time to time." End quote. And I will read another one here, and I quote, "During the last weeks of work at the studio while filming The Young Raja, he was constantly in a bad mood. As sadness came home with him at night, he would tear off his Oriental Prince costume, and his nervousness became intense. He complained about his role, about what little money he was making, and the ingratitude of his bosses. His stomach tortured him continuously, and he had a large quantity of bicarbonate, which would alleviate him temporarily. He was so nervous that during meals he would whine incessantly, and his chronic indigestion would return immediately. Carl Wiedermann, Jean de Lemure, Douglas Gerard, and myself did what we could to boost his morale, but it was so painful for us to see that man, the object of adoration of the masses there in front of us, sick and teary-eyed." And one more excerpt here, and I quote, "For 10 days we traveled through London with a cameraman. I filmed many documentaries like this showing him on his trip through Europe. On the eve of his departure for France, the manager of the hotel presented me with a bill of damage that soared up to a considerable amount of money. Rudy had ruined 24 lace pillow shams with the black hair varnish that he would put on his head to hide an emerging bald spot, and the dogs damaged the carpets. We finally made it out of Croydon. During the following weeks, I went all over, preparing his trips and hiring cameramen." End quote. So up to this point in Florey's narrative, I found nothing revealing the slightest innuendo or nary a comment which could be construed as proving Valentino was gay. And this brings us to those letters which the Valentino porn fiction writer claims are racy and proof of a sexual relationship between Valentino and Florey. For me, these letters were the bombshells in this valuable document. Now, the first one is a letter dated December 29th, 1922. And Valentino writes, "It is with joy that I receive your charming letter, which is the first I have received since you have undertaken your departure towards beautiful Hollywood, as you call it. I wonder, is it true that you wrote me, or is it only to make me think you did? Thank you much, old man, for the good publicity that you did for me. And I'm going to give the order to Abby to make me a new photo set for you that I will send as soon as it is ready. At the same time, I'm going to send you some speeches I made at the radio exposition, and that nearly 1 million radio fans heard, about the bad methods of producing the films adopted by the trusts, like Famous Players, and also another explaining the mission of the future of cinema in world affairs. I would like you to translate it in order to send it to your foreign magazines. I think that is good publicity. Tell those 2 guys, Lemure and Caracciolo, to write me a word, and tell Jean not to forget to exercise my horses with Caracciolo if they really want to. Send me their address. I should stop now because I must leave for Philadelphia to talk on the radio. Greetings to all my good friends, and plenty of wishes from me and my wife also. Take care. Your friend, Rudolph. The next letter is dated May 19th. In my last letter, I promised to write as soon as I had some good news to give, and here I am about to make good on my promise. To begin with, I tell you that I decided to clear out of Europe at the end of this tour. That is to say, most certainly the 8th of July. I still don't know if it is because of movies or for a vacation, but it is certain that I'm going to leave on the Aquitania or on the Olympic around the 23rd or 24th of July. You are going to say to yourself, I am happy, but when can I clear out? Or at least it's good news for Rudy, but not for me. I told Kenneth Patterson to reserve you a first-class cabin for England, leaving New York on the 11th or the 12th of July, so that you can arrange a grand reception for me in London. As soon as all is arranged in London, you will go to Paris to do the same thing, and return to England in time for us to make the ship. You will reserve some rooms for us, and one for you already at the Ritz in London and the Ritz in Paris. It is necessary to have absolute secrecy up until you are on the ship, and better yet until I am also in Europe. Thanks again for sending me your Filmland, and I am very happy for the success that it has received. We will make a Valentino book, and another one also showing my return to Italy after 10 years. And another excerpt here dated May 20th. I want to tell you also that the other day in New York I posed for new photos, and I chose 28 different poses. And I put it in order for 200 glossy prints of the different poses, so that you will have enough pictures of me to start until I arrive in London and in Paris in order to make some new ones. I also decided that the 10th of July is a little too late for your departure, and I changed your departure for the 1st of July. So, instead of racy letters between Valentino and Florey, as we are led to believe we would find, in this translation we find letters that are stunning in their proof that Rudolph Valentino was in charge of his business, as I have always alleged. These letters do not prove he was gay, but they do prove he was not subject to swindlers and controlling people. These letters prove he was full of ideas about his work and the presentation of his universally appreciated image. These letters reveal how intrinsically involved Valentino was in his career, specifically his publicity. They reveal his grasp on the working mechanics of his sophisticated success, and they reveal, as I have always said, he gave the orders to those who worked for him. These letters bring about a definitive end to that insult and utter lie being spread about Valentino by those claiming he was some victim, a pawn of everyone in his inner circle, it seems to them, from his trusted manager, George Ullman, to his wife, Natasha, to his godfather, Frank Manillo. After reading these letters, there is no doubt Valentino was in charge and aggressive about his plans and directives. Well, I have to ask, where is that racy rhetoric? How do these business letters reveal anything but a tough and very powerful Valentino on top of his game and running his business like a champion? And I have to ask, how does the magic lantern reveal anything about the subject of Valentino's alleged homosexuality and or bisexuality, which has been endlessly the focus of the Valentino porn fiction writer and his ilk for years? When in reading on in the narrative, the English translation of Robert Florey's piece hands them more bad news. Florey concludes with an anecdote, which I'm going to read, about Valentino's advice to him when he told his boss, Rudy, that he was about to marry. And I quote, "A passing friend in New York had told Valentino that I had intended to marry. It wasn't true, but Valentino so reacted to the news of that tall tale. I responded to Rudy to reassure him and to tell him that it didn't enter my mind to wed before my departure, which brought about him giving me, when I rejoined him, a long speech about his views on the subject of marriage. He always dreamed of the ideal mate, an ethereal spouse, not made for the flame of desire, but for ennobling him, of a woman not only offering grace, sensitivity, harmony, elegance, and a blend of material beauty and ideal beauty of form. The woman he was looking for was not of this earth. He desired exquisite, delicate, incomparable, virginal, stunning, angelic, fresh, divine, serene, fascinating, diaphanous, and extreme sweetness in character, and above all, unearthly. And so, in love, Valentino was disillusioned, or perhaps it is more exact to write that he was disappointed, because his first wife left the honeymoon suite the dawn of the day of their wedding, and the union with his second wife was of short duration. Valentino's pre-conjugal adventures, of which we talked often, had left him with a few bad memories. American women, the female viewing audience of cinema, saw him as the ideal lover. They all envied the good fortune of his partners that he kidnapped in the desert on an Arabian horse, and the young girls refused to leave after the showing in order to see the movie again. They forgot to chew their gum or popcorn, and they wrote him incessant letters that he would show us and then tell us, "You see how much I'm loved?" In 1912, while spending a few weeks in Paris, he made the acquaintance of a young music hall dancer. For reasons he never explained to us, she refused to crown his passion, and she was insulting. He was barely 18 years old, but the bitter impression left on him from that rejection continued to affect him for 10 years. End quote. So here we find more evidence of Valentino's focus on his women, and it is obvious women were the direction of his sexuality.
So you found that Florey admitted that he had nothing more to do with Valentino. Their friendship ended. Is it true?
Yes. Although Florey does not mention this specifically in The Magic Lantern. He dismisses what happened by writing, "And then I had little occasion to see Valentino anymore." Florey does not elaborate on why that is. I think this presents a mystery about these two men, Paul Ivanhoe and Robert Florey. Because both of these men vanished from Valentino's life, it seems, and their memories appear to stop about the same time. Yet they reappear in the 1960s to grant interviews and receive some spotlight about their affiliations with one Rudolph Valentino. They also begin working together on some television shows in the early 1960s, such as Twilight Zone, Petticoat Junction, and Batman, all produced by, who else? Rudolph Valentino memorabilia collector Bill Self.
Bill Self would tell you something interesting about Robert Florey.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. As listeners of our podcast know, I interviewed Bill Self while I was researching my Rudolph Valentino biography, Affairs Valentino. Bill Self made a point of getting to know everyone and anyone who was then, this was the 1950s, 1960s, those who were still alive who knew Valentino. He knew Rudolph Valentino's first wife, Jean Acker, his trusted manager, George Ullman, Alberto and Jean Valentino, and he knew both Robert Florey and Paul Ivanhoe. And it was in one interview when Self was telling me how no one ever said a bad word to him about Rudy, when he caught himself and told me that the only person who ever said anything bad to him about Rudy was Robert Florey, and he added, because he was the only person Rudy ever personally fired. Now, I found that important to remember while reading The Magic Lantern. Florey did have a history with Valentino, which involved his being fired. I had to ask, was his revealing such unflattering and highly personal things about Valentino in The Magic Lantern Florey's revenge? But Bill Self's comment also revealed Valentino did not usually do the firing of his staff. This was no doubt left to his manager, George Ullman.
You told me the other day about a letter Self carried with him which Ivanhoe wrote.
Yes, Bill Self told me that Paul Ivanhoe wrote him a letter of personal recommendation addressed to Natasha Rambova, which Bill Self kept in his wallet at all times. I guess just in case he ran into her. Natasha was brought back to Los Angeles, gravely ill in 1966, a few months before she died. And I guess it was then Self wanted to meet her. Despite Ivanhoe's glowing letters, she refused to speak with Bill Self. So Robert Florey told Self that Rudolph Valentino fired him, personally. Did this mean that Valentino was so furious he had to cut Florey out of his business himself? For me, that just conjured up an image of Valentino's rage. Not a good moment there. And in knowing this about the end of the Valentino-Florey affiliation, The shade Florey casts on Valentino in The Magic Lantern sets a definite tone. But it is not the tone which the porn fiction writer alleged it to be. Not at all. It is a tone of revenge. Not so hidden with those clever personal memories, we find Florey's revenge for having been the only person Rudolph Valentino was ever so pissed at that he fired him personally. Now, in Emily Leiter's book, Dark Lover, although she cites Florey's Magic Lantern heavily, she insinuates that Florey left Valentino's employ because Natasha demanded he go. Leiter does not explore this premise any further. Today I'm going to dispute this based on some new documentation, recently translated from the French by you, Renato, thank you, in which the real reason for Rudolph Valentino's very personal firing of Robert Florey is no doubt revealed. In Jeanne de Recville's biography of Rudolph Valentino, which is in French, she shares her research into Florey's behavior at the time, as it was reported both in the American press and in the French press. I will read the excerpt from the translation of her book from a section she titled Rudy Francophobe. And I quote, "According to Yves Gros-Richard, author of the text of an illustrated biography of Rudolph Valentino, published in François, when Rudy was in Milan in 1923, he told Robert Florey that his stay in Paris disappointed him a lot. It sounds odd when one remembers the words he uttered at the Plaza Athénée at the end of the dinner on August 15th, which were reported in the press. According to Gros-Richard, Rudy complained to Florey about the general reception, which he found modest, about the kitchen of Deauville, which he found detestable. Finally, he would have said, "The girls of the Parisian shows are uniformly ugly. The pretty girls from Fabiano's drawings, Héroart, Vincent, Léonic, exist only in their imagination. They are all too fat." Now, an American editor, seeking to be zealous, seizes this triple verdict and adds pepper to what Rudy never said. That's why in March of 1924 we read in the magazine Movie Weekly an article that highlights the francophobic remarks of Mr. Valentino. In the issue of March 16, 1924, our Ciné magazine discloses its disdain in a piece signed by André Trichant. But Rudolph Valentino does not deserve the blame that is placed on him. Most readers defend him by pointing out that it was said first by Robert Florey, and if he really received this confidence from Rudy, he should and could have restrained from making it so widely known. End quote. So Robert Florey's loose lips sank his Rudolph Valentino ship. Can you imagine Rudolph Valentino's fury to hear that some things he might have said in private to Florey, which are critical of France and French women, were being spread about and even printed in movie magazines? And if he did not say these things, then all the more rage that Florey made this public. The tired and cheap explanation that Natasha controlled her husband and had Florey fired is a fictional one, and in de Recville's research we find the truth. Florey's blabbing caused a crisis and a furor which took some doing to calm down in France. One of Valentino's friends and colleagues, French director Rene Clair, rose to the occasion of the French outrage at Florey's indiscretion and wrote a letter which was published for Valentino and his public. Now, I read the translation of Rene Clair's letter as it is included in the de Recville book, and I quote from Rene Clair. "Let a friend of Rudolph Valentino add a few words to the article you are dedicating to him in your March the 16th issue, under the title Rudolph Valentino Francophobe. I do only know of the article published in the Movie Weekly, the extract you give. For this reason, I cannot judge it, but I have the honor of knowing Rudolph Valentino, and I can say that during their stay in France, Mr. and Mrs. Valentino have only shown their friendly feelings for France. If Rudolph Valentino severely judges the people of Deauville and the Folies Bergère, don't you think, like him, that this public hardly represents France, but just foreigners in France, which is not the same thing? I was in Deauville with Rudolph Valentino. If he was disappointed, it was because he found there very few French, and so many unbearable foreigners. I must admit that on that point I did not contradict him. On the other hand, during his walks in the Normandy countryside, and in many other circumstances, he never ceased to rave about the beauty of our country. All this would have had nothing but small importance if the title of your article were not aimed to divulge one of my few sincere friends in America's false statement. While so many American stars passing through Paris overwhelm us with compliments and empty promises, as they do in all countries, Rudolph Valentino is the only one, I think, who has not spoken much, but who has begun to do something for the French people. He is the only one to have brought a Frenchman, his friend André Dauvin, with him to New York, to have pushed him into the studio's world, to have nothing neglected for his success. He is the only one, to my knowledge, to have tried to have a French movie filmed in America. This is a very recent matter, and I know well about this subject. And knowing the hostility towards France of the Hollywood studios, and moreover of the hostility of one of our supposed friends, we can only feel towards Rudolph Valentino true gratitude. Finally, he does not announce, like so many others, large work projects in France. He is the only one to really think about it. It is possible that in the future, he will permit me to give you details on this point. I would add that for his latest film, Monsieur Beaucaire, Rudolph Valentino hired, in addition to André Dauvin, a French woman, Mademoiselle Paulette Duval, and he commissioned the costumes for that movie to a French artist. Don't you think this, on all these facts, are more significant than words whose interpretation generates only misgivings? I am very sorry that Cine Magazine, so well known in the film world, contributes to give of Rudolph Valentino a fictitious character that is not his. That is why I would be very grateful if you would like to publish this letter while awaiting the clarifications that Rudolph Valentino will not fail to bring to you himself. With thanks, please accept, Rene Clair." End quote. So, it is astounding that in the 1950s and 1960s, Florey had the gall to revise his history, and adding insult to injury, he includes once again those Francophobic comments which got him fired.
When Balthasar Coué writes about Valentino's close circle of friends at Falcon Lair in 1926, neither Ivano or Florey are there.
No, they're not. And finding this French insight, these excerpts I just read, makes the Ivano and Florey collective grandstanding later in their lives a bit confusing and objectionable. They seem to be getting some more mileage out of Rudy. And Ivano, as we spoke about in our previous episode about the cause of Valentino's death, he alleged on a French TV show in 1972 some outrageous theory that Valentino was stabbed. He seemed to be grabbing some spotlight from his old pal Rudy. And in a way which makes little sense, he gave several interviews about his friendships with Valentino and appears to have collaborated with Robert Florey in establishing their notoriety through their Valentino histories and comments. Ivano also tells us, and sensationally, he talks about seeing Valentino nude with an erection after making love to Natasha. Now, I'm not saying this did not happen. I'm just asking, is this something to share? But with Florey, we find him claiming Valentino referred to his fans as being stupid and gives the details of his soiling hotel linens with hair dyes and oils. Florey's portrait of Rudolph Valentino is not very flattering and more than a tad mean-spirited, I think. So these two men, Ivano and Florey, eagerly embraced Bill South for work, and both appear in the credits of his many TV shows, as well as the series The Schlitz Playhouse of Players, which I cover in Affairs Valentino.
So, how can the Magic Lantern be considered a source for the gay claims?
Well, it can't be. I have still never found one piece of credible documentation that Valentino was gay, and to date, it is a concocted falsehood, and I am not homophobic for making this assertion. I believe Florey's Magic Lantern is today fraudulently cited as a source of gay material only because it is in French and a rare manuscript, making it unavailable for most people to reference or even read. They count on not much fact-checking going on. This citing a source which is only available in a certain language is an easy way to hide the fact that there is no legitimate source. Now, you know, back in 2009, I challenged another source, a book, in which the Valentino porn fiction writer claimed he found all those homosexual anecdotes which he included in his books. This source was also a foreign Rudolph Valentino book, and I think the porn fiction writer was sure I could never reference such a remote publication, but I did. When I pressed him for information, I was told it was Il mio diario privato, published in Italian by Paolo Orlandelli. Now, in this publication, Orlandelli made the translation from English to Italian of Rudolph Valentino's My Private Diary, a studio-generated publicity piece published in the 1920s. So, porn fiction writer had to retreat on that one. So I think the use of books in foreign languages as a source by these people to claim proof Valentino was gay is a scam. I called out the first book cited in this scam in 2009. And I here call citing the Florey chapter as a source a scam. And I call scam and calling those letters racy. Anyone reading them knows this is an absolute falsehood. So I think as we see, there are some intriguing revelations in the Magic Lantern. But there's nothing to support the claim that Rudolph Valentino was a closeted homosexual or bisexual. In fact, Florey reveals a great deal which stands in opposition to this. Again, a book in a foreign language, foreign to Americans that is, has been tagged as a source in a sinister effort to hide the fact there are no sources at all. And I will add that because I tackled this subject, as you know, Renato, this contorting of Valentino's history and truth to fit their agenda, this has fueled their not-so-thinly veiled campaign to demean my work, our work. This has been going on ever since I pointed these things out. But for me, historical accuracy about real historical figures must matter.
So now I know you want to mention something which was posted this past week.
I do, Renato. This past week, a photo was posted on one of the more notorious Rudolph Valentino Facebook groups page. And I say notorious, using the Webster's definition of, quote, something famous and well-known, typically for a bad quality or deed, end quote. Now, this was a photo of George Ullman's son, Bob, in which he was shown as he appeared in the movie Lummox when he was 5 years old. The insinuations were made by the administrators that Ullman was abusing and exploiting his child. This was added to the heap of lies about Ullman which these administrators nurture. Now, the appearance in that movie was not a bad thing for Bobby Ullman, not at all. Do you know why I can say that? Because I knew Bob Ullman personally and interviewed him over a period of 2 years. I dedicated Affairs Valentino to him because he pushed me in my research to discover the court records and the truth about his father's stellar performance as Rudolph Valentino's executor. Now, Bob Ullman told me about his appearance in the movie Lummox with stars in his 80-year-old eyes, and it was a magical childhood memory for him, and one he was so happy to relate to me. He asked me to try and find a copy of the film, which I did not, lamentably, before he passed away. So this smarmy and cruel innuendo targeting Bobby Ullman and his dad, George Ullman, is so wide of the mark it scarcely merits mention. And in my opinion, these cheap shots at Ullman only reveal this Facebook administrator's unhappiness with my work and my sources, which have to date been only supportive of Ullman as a man of high integrity, a beloved father and grandfather. I allege today that this administrator's unhappiness with my years of documentation, including the documentation that Rudolph Valentino was not gay, and my daring to say this publicly, is the only reason for his endless obsession to get Ullman. I can state with authority, and has been proven today here, as I shared some of the Magic Lantern with you, our listeners, that these men, Ullman, Florey, Ivanhoe, they worked for Valentino. And at times, yes, they were his friends, but there is not one scintilla of proof that they were gay. And it is revealing to note that Ullman was never fired. And he stood at Rudolph Valentino's deathbed with the godfather Frank Manillo. I think this speaks volumes as to Ullman's character and Rudolph Valentino's trust in him. Now, I add here that in The Magic Lantern, Robert Florey writes how he attended the auction of Rudolph Valentino's estate, where he witnessed George Ullman with tears in his eyes, and he said he did not know what to say to console him. Now, anyone can read the entire English translation of The Magic Lantern, because we have posted it in 3 files on a designated Google Drive link, which can be found on the Affairs Valentino Facebook page, on the Affairs Valentino Twitter account, and my Tumblr blog, which is evelynzumaya.tumblr.com. And I add, for the administrator's benefit, that as far as it being breaking news that Bobby Ullman was in this movie, hardly, because I wrote about this in Affairs Valentino and it's been public for 10 years. You can reference page 147 in Affairs Valentino.
I think it is time for them to read the book and all of our books. It looks that somebody has to study a little more and with intellectual honesty.
A good point. Yes, Renato, that sure is the truth. In closing today, I think contrary to Florey's intent in writing The Magic Lantern, his chapter reveals a kind of sad and somewhat sordid story of Florey and Ivanhoe. 2 men, as we noted, who are not mentioned in Balthasar Couet's first-hand accounts of Rudolph Valentino's life in Falcon Lair in 1926. They're not mentioned as friends who were hanging out with Valentino during the last year of his life. These men were not Rudolph Valentino's lovers. They worked for him. They were friends, fired personally or not, but they worked for him. That was their affiliation. Of course, they were valuable to the collectors who, in establishing their Valentino currency, this made Ivanhoe and Florey real assets. And Bill Self, in befriending and hiring them, set the rate, so to speak, for Ivanhoe and Florey's value. From their memoirs to their individual Valentino memorabilia to their very presence, which in Self's case contributed to his Valentino cachet and his reputation as the dominant Valentino collector. So Renato, I hope Rudolph Valentino fans and followers on those notorious Valentino Facebook groups, when they read what these administrators claim is truth, I hope they are not gullible. Question them for the sources and read those sources. And if they're not in your language, have them translated. Don't let these people pull this scam on you any longer. Innuendo is not fact.
And I hope our listeners will find our books and enjoy them, because we are always eager to share the stories and information we have uncovered.
Renato, despite the objections I have to The Magic Lantern, thanks to Robert Florey, we are able there to hear the confident voice of Valentino himself, speaking from the helm of his great success. I want to close by reading one last excerpt from those wonderful business-like letters. And I quote one that was written on May 26, 1923. Only a word on the run to tell you that you will leave England on exactly July 3rd on the Cunard ship Aquitania. I have reserved and paid for a first-class cabin. It is a beautiful luxury boat, and I'm sure that you will be comfortable and at ease. Hurry with your passport, etc., because it will not wait till the last minute. End quote. Now, as always, I want to thank those who support our work and who send materials and information and commentary. Your every kind word is so greatly appreciated. Thank you.
And as the usual, I will say, Fiat Justitia, Ruat Caelum. And for the good guys, arrivederci.